Today we have a crazy revenge story against an adoptive family. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, the wedding revenge. From experience, I've come to realize that one thing with people who end up being the other person in a relationship is that they never know that they are the other person. Funny, right? And as I said, I'm unfortunately speaking from experience. I used to think Doug, 27-year-old male, and I, 25-year-old female, had the kind of love people wrote songs about. I was confident and loving, and I poured my all into the relationship. Doug was charming, attentive, and always knew how to make me laugh when life got tough. He was the man I fell in love with when I did not think I was searching for love. The kind of love that just suddenly hit you. We had our routines like other cliché couples did. We had Friday night dinners at our favorite Italian place near my apartment, lazy Sundays binge-watching old sitcoms, and spontaneous road trips that ended in cheap motels and unforgettable memories. To me, it felt perfect, and that should have been a pointer to the fact that I was in a bubble of my own. Looking back, maybe it was too perfect. Better put, I judged things that were not perfect as though they were. There were moments, tiny ones, that didn't sit right, like how his phone was always face down when we were together, or how he avoided introducing me to his coworkers at the office party. "It's just work," he would say with that disarming smile of his, and I believed him. After all, I trusted him because I loved him. Then there was the trip he canceled at the last minute, claiming an urgent business meeting had come up, or the way his responses grew slower and less thoughtful over time, only for him to suddenly become all loving. When I would bring it up, he would brush it off, telling me I worried too much or that I deserved better than his busy schedule. He had this way of making me doubt my instincts, of making me feel guilty for even questioning him, but I ignored those signs. Putting more pressure on him at those times just felt like I was knowingly damning the relationship to fall. I have had my share of failed relationships because I was too pushy. I didn't want the so-called perfect thing I had going with Doug to end in the same way. I loved Doug with everything I had, and I wanted to believe he loved me the same way. After all, he was my Doug, the man I thought I'd spend forever with. But as it turned out, forever was way shorter than I could have ever imagined with Doug, and where the end came was not something I could have seen from a mile away. The day I discovered the truth was a day I'll never forget, and it's a story I can tell in the exact manner it happened for as long as I live. Like every normal day, it started with a knock on my door and a courier handing me a pristine white envelope, my name written in gold cursive. The delivery was especially weird because I wasn't expecting anything and I wasn't supposed to be home. That weekend was supposed to be our anniversary. It was the second one we would have together, so I'd taken time off from work. We had this whole thing planned with Doug, and my friends knew that I was not to be disturbed. In fact, the whole thing was their idea. I was certain that the envelope could not have been from them. Even if they had anything to deliver, they would have waited till I told them the coast was clear. The only reason I was home was because Doug said some last-minute deadline came up and he had to settle it before he could make time for the plans we had made. So I opened the delivery with casual curiosity, but nothing could have prepared me for the content. It was a wedding invitation. Of who? Well, Doug and Callie. I knew the name Doug was familiar, but in that instant, my head went blank. I couldn't piece the two names together to make any sense of connection, so I kept checking the content. The date was a couple of weeks away, but it still didn't make any sense. I began to wonder who the Doug was, if it was a silly, cruel joke or if it was really my boyfriend. But before I could deny the possibility, I realized that inside the original envelope the wedding invite came in, there was a note in Doug's handwriting. In some ways, the whole thing would not have hurt as much as he did if I'd not seen the written short message he attached. "Vanessa, I hope this finds you well. I know this might come as a surprise, but I wanted to share this important moment in my life with you. I hope we can still be friends after this. You deserve happiness too. Move on and take care of yourself, Doug." At this point, I was conflicted. If this was Doug getting married, it meant that this was not a new relationship. It meant that he was two-timing while he was with me, and I ended up pulling the short straw. Move on? Friends? My hands trembled as I reread the words, each sentence a punch to my gut. He didn't even have the decency to tell me in person. For years, I thought I was the love of his life, the one he shared everything with, but apparently Doug had Callie, the woman he was now proudly marrying while I was left to piece together how I fit into this twisted puzzle. And I had no one. To say I was humiliated was an understatement. It was a mix of shock, heartbreak, and admiration all in one. I'd been his other woman without even realizing it. Every canceled plan, every excuse, every little red flag I ignored, it all made sense now. Doug had played me, lied to me, and then had the audacity to send me an invitation to witness his happy ending. I kept asking myself one question. How could I have been so stupid? My stomach churned and I felt an overwhelming urge to throw the invitation into the trash. But as I stood there holding it, something in me shifted. I wasn't going to cry over Doug anymore. He had played me, disrespected me, and now expected me to just move on while he waltzed into his happy ever after? No, not a chance. Doug needed to know he couldn't treat people like this and get away with it. If he wanted me to move on, I'd give him a parting gift he'd never forget. That's when the idea struck me. I would go to his wedding since he was so gracious to invite me. I wouldn't yell or scream. I'd let my presence and my words do the damage. I could bet anything that he had underestimated just how long I could descend. But like they say, if they go low, you go lower. And that was precisely what I did with Doug. The day of the wedding arrived and I was ready to make my grand entrance. I made sure Doug did not suspect a thing. After I got the delivery, I thought to reach out to him to demand an explanation on why he thought it was only to ruin 2 years together. But I decided not to. That would have made him feel like he had some kind of power over me. I needed him to think I could care less about the fact that he jilted me. It was necessary to make him lose guard to get access to do every and any destructive thing that came to mind. I stepped out of the car in a flowing white gown, the kind of dress that could make heads turn at any wedding. The confidence that overcame me shocked me. I looked every bit like someone who belonged there, or perhaps someone who was meant to stand at the altar. The entire hall was breathtaking. It was probably everything Callie would have hoped her perfect day had. The only thing was that she would have an unexpected star performer because she chose to marry a two-timing jerk. The wedding was yet to start when I walked up the aisle. I walked as if I owned the room, nodding politely at guests who stared a little too long. The chatter among the guests turned into hushed whispers. I could feel their eyes on me trying to figure out who I was. Some looked confused, others intrigued, but a few exchanged glances that clearly asked, "Is she the bride?" I couldn't help but smirk at the thought. As I reached the seating area, I noticed Doug standing near the altar, laughing with someone. His eyes found mine, and for a moment, the color drained from his face. He wasn't expecting me to actually show up, given that I didn't bother to dignify his delivery with a response, let alone like this. I gave him a small wave, the kind a close friend might give, and his panic was deliciously obvious. The murmurs grew louder as I confidently made my way to an empty chair near the front, claiming it as if I belonged there. Someone even asked, "Are you family of the bride or groom?" I leaned in, grinning, saying, "Oh, I'm with the groom," I said sweetly, watching the ripple of confusion spread. The chaos was just the beginning, and I was ready for it. I saw Doug walking up to where I was seated. I knew he would quietly try to push me out of the hall, so I stood up and met him halfway. Immediately, I got to him. I made sure I increased my voice while I greeted him and made it seem like we were extremely familiar. Then I heard someone murmur, "Is she a friend of the groom? Maybe an ex?" So I patted Doug's arm affectionately and said, "You've got that nervous look again, just like before your big presentation. Don't worry, Dougie, you've got this." His jaw tightened. You could literally see him holding back with the last bit of restraint he had, but I was enjoying every bit of the encounter. I had taken 4 weeks of belittling myself over what we shared and how I was going to shatter every hope of him having a perfect wedding. I had made my peace with it. It didn't take long for Callie to notice me when the ceremony started. I had made sure of that. After the ceremony ended, I continued my overly familiar high-pitched talk with Doug as the newlywed moved around greeting their guests. From across the room, I saw her eyes narrow as she watched me. I saw her smile falter and her steps quicken as she made her way towards us. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but laced with suspicion. "Who are you?" I turned to her, feigning surprise. "Oh, Callie, you're even more beautiful in person. I've heard so much about you." I offered her my hand, but she didn't take it. Her arms remained stiff at her sides, her eyes flickering between Doug and me. "Who are you?" she repeated, her tone sharper this time. I sighed, dropping the friendly act. "I'm Vanessa, Doug's girlfriend. Well, ex-girlfriend for about a month now, apparently. I guess I should be saying congratulations. He sent me this lovely invitation just 4 weeks ago telling me to move on with my life. Sweet, right?" The color drained from Callie's face and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she processed my words. Doug looked like he wanted to sink into the ground, his mouth opening and closing. No words came out. "Anyway," I said, smoothing my dress and picking up my clutch, "I think my job here is done. Best of luck to you, Callie. You're going to need it." With that, I turned and walked out. I deduced that chaos was about to explode and I had no intention of sticking around for the fallout. There's definitely a lot of words you can use to describe this guy, but moron is probably a pretty good one when you consider the fact that most people who are such blatantly cheaters and so devastatingly cheating would never do something as crazy as hard launching the reveal that they're actually dedicated to another person this whole time through a wedding invitation to their side piece. I mean, what possible good could have come out of OP showing up to that wedding in any context? Especially if this guy's bride didn't seem to be too aware of who OP even was. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review for listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is, my ex-girlfriend cheated on me with her roommate, I got petty, and got my revenge. My now ex-girlfriend, female 22, cheated on me with someone she wrongly introduced me to and felt not the slightest bit remorseful. In a state of hurt, I decided to get back at her in the pettiest way I possibly could have, even though it basically ended our friendship and our already lost relationship. I, female 21, am the only child of both my parents. No, this wasn't because both of my parents at the time didn't want kids or anything. It was simply due to the fact that my mother was unable to have more children for my father, as it was her dream to have her own home filled with kids running around the home, as she once told me. She was pretty young when she had me too, so it was pretty believable. However, the cruel hands of fate were ever so cruel. My mother was soon diagnosed with multiple terminal illnesses, all of which soon took her life after a whole year and a half of countless hospital visitations, appointments, and treatments. I was only a child at the time. I think 3 or 4 years, if my calculations are accurate. I can't remember much from back then, but the one thing that would forever remain ingrained in my memory was the sight of my father by her deathbed, as he cried like never before. I was unaware of the fact that I would never see my mother, but this wouldn't dawn on me until later on. Now moving on, right after my mother's passing, my father completely shut himself off from everyone and anyone. I guess I was the only one that he ever showed the slightest bit of emotion and affection for. As for everyone else, he just maintained his stoic persona and basically remained uninterested in anything and everything. I would soon come to realize that this was all because he was still mourning my mother, even after a couple of years had passed. Now, we moved a whole lot because of this, and by this I clearly mean my father's inability to interact with people and basically share his problems with the people closest to him. He just shut off from everyone he knew at the time, and right after my mother's passing, he was buried in a mountain of debt, all of which he couldn't cover at the time. Now, I'm not blaming him or anything, but I just think that if he'd been able to do what he needed to have done at the time, people in his life would surely have been able to provide him with what little support they could at the time. Anyways, all of that happened, and we were in a really tough place back then. Well, all of that soon changed as my father got introduced and referred by one of his childhood friends, and someone I usually call uncle, to a company that was looking desperately to hire someone of his talents. The pay was significantly more than what they usually offered for that position in their company, and this was because they were in desperate need of his services at the time. However, this also meant that he was going to be working for more hours and not always going to be home whenever I needed him to be. But it was all in all still fine, as sooner rather than later, he was finally able to secure a home for us. And this was where I met my now ex-girlfriend, childhood best friend, and the reason I'm writing this story in the first place. Let's call her June, for anonymity's sake. Now, June and I met when we both were still very young teenagers. We met on occasion when my father employed the services of her brother to babysit me while he was away. This was the perfect choice, seeing as June's place was quite literally opposite ours, and my father also noticed that June and myself got along pretty well. He just thought it only proper to leave me in the care of someone, or rather somewhere, I would get to feel welcome and basically have fun with someone my age. And I must say, it was not such a bad idea. Even though I couldn't see my dad on some days, I was still comforted by June. Now, June and I got along pretty well, like I said, so much so that some would often confuse us for sisters rather than friends. And it wasn't such a bad idea, seeing as I'd always longed for a sibling. A long time passed, we both were in high school before we knew it, and a whole lot had changed in both of our lives. And these weren't ordinary changes, they were pretty significant changes. These were changes that would quite literally shape the rest of both of our lives moving forward. When we both were in high school, I came out of the closet, and so did June. We both also became open with our feelings and about being in an actual relationship with each other. Now, it wasn't like we planned it or anything, but it just kind of felt like the right thing to do. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or anything, it was more like we really only felt comfortable when we were finally out with our feelings and who we were. In high school, it came as no surprise to every single one of our friends, as some were already expecting that, while others, who were still of the idea that we were both sisters, were simply feigning support, but on a more clearer note, they just felt some type of way seeing that they thought otherwise. Anyways, that's that about that. Now moving on to why I'm actually writing this story of mine, fast forward a little bit to post-high school. Every single one of our friends that we graduated together were already either off to college or have started working a part-time job or the other, just to make a living for themselves, as at that time, not everyone was privileged enough to afford college. Now, unfortunately for me, I was among the less privileged, as although things had been going well from the onset for my father, things would eventually take a turn for the worse, as the company he was working for would soon start going through some financial difficulties. This would, in the long run, financially cripple him for a while. This in turn really hindered my father from offering what little support he could to contributing to my college tuition. Now I had to resort to some other means to at least stand to afford it. The one person that came to my aid at that time was none other than June. Now, June had little to no problem in getting into the college of her choosing, as her parents were financially stable enough to support her, and so when she left for college, I had to pick up working several part-time jobs, mainly to support my father in footing both of our expenses. June, on her own end, was trying what little she could and helping out too, until one very day when she did something totally unthinkable. Something not even I would have ever thought possible at the time. She actually basically sends me in cash, every single penny I would need to cover my college tuition and various other expenses. Now I had loads of questions, as I was honestly wondering what, or rather where, she could have possibly gotten such a huge amount from. I decided not to touch a single penny until she answered some truly necessary questions. A whole lot of time had gone by since she went to college, and it wasn't even enough reason for her to do what she did for me, but then it happened. She didn't come back home for a while, as when she eventually did, she avoided my various lines of questioning, until I eventually gave up and made efficient use of what she gifted me. Little did I know what was to come. Fast forward a few months, I'd already applied to the same college as June, and I really wanted to shorten the distance between the both of us so that we may be together, and this all went as planned. Although I was a freshman and she was in her second year, we were still together, and that was all that mattered. Now that we were this close to each other, I made it my goal to figure out where exactly June got the money she sent me some few months back. And I must tell you, nothing could have prepared me for what was to come. Now, a few weeks passed, leading to a few months, and I came up with nothing until I eventually found out what exactly, or rather who exactly, she was involved with. Now, these friends of hers weren't ordinary, as the one thing I would come out to find is that they were big-time cyber criminals, and they not only targeted high-value individuals, but also high-end companies. Their hauls from these operations of theirs, when I found out, left me stunned. Not only was this their daily means of livelihood, but they derived joy in doing so, and to my greatest surprise, June was the mastermind behind it all. I obviously couldn't believe what I'd found out, which was through several friends of hers, and I even confronted her about all of this, as I couldn't believe whatever it was I heard until I'd confirmed it myself. And to no surprise at all, she didn't deny it. In fact, she was so proud of herself that she was offering me a spot in their operations. I wasn't comfortable with doing, or rather getting involved in whatever it was they were up to, and so I just left, without saying a single word too. Little did I know that the worst was yet to come. Ever since our confrontation, we both rarely saw each other, and this wasn't healthy for our relationship. It wasn't even up to a week since that day since we spoke last, and when I took the first step to reach out to her and meet in person, she wasn't available. I had to find her myself. The first place I thought to look was her dorm. And what I found, nothing could have prepared me. She was apparently cheating on me with the person she introduced to me as her roommate. I was devastated. I couldn't believe what was right before me. I stormed out of there before I would have done something truly regrettable. She sought me several times to explain herself because apparently there was a reason for that, but I wasn't having it. There was nothing she could have said that would truly make me understand the reason behind her actions. Now, even though we were together for the longest time, she was over me so quickly. I started to wonder whether I really meant something to her after all this time, and the only thing I could conclude was that she obviously didn't. This was what just drove me to do what I did. Now, you might call it snitching on my friend, but it was just my own way of getting back at her and basically getting revenge, although it may seem petty. Now, seeing as I knew basically everything there was to know about their multitude of operations, I basically held their fates in my hands, and I did what she also wouldn't have expected by turning her over to the authorities, by telling them everything there was to know about their operations, in exchange for my immunity, as I would have eventually been found complacent to aiding them no matter how I wanted to play this. So at least that way, I would avoid being lumped in with them when the time for punishment was upon them. And just as planned, June, alongside all of her friends, were found guilty on several counts of cybercriminality among others, and they received the maximum sentences for each one of their crimes. It might seem a bit excessive, resorting to basically ending her life and that of all of her accomplices, but it was the only thing I could have thought at the time to get back at her. And I don't regret my actions. It's been months since the incident, and I must say, I don't feel like a horrible person. All I can say is if this is true, and they had an operation where they were able to steal seemingly a lot of money from very well-off people and companies, I wouldn't want to be complicit in this either, but I also wouldn't want to be the one person who clearly ratted them and all of the people involved in this operation out. I feel like I'd be paranoid for the rest of my days that I'd end up like that healthcare guy. Our next story is, my adopted family almost ruined my life. My biological family came to rescue. I, male 26, was an orphan right from birth and was placed at the mercy of my beloved adoptive family by the orphanage home. Over the course of my growing up, they decided to make my entire life literal heck on earth, practically ruining my entire childhood. When I had the opportunity to exact my revenge on them, I spared no effort at all in doing so. I never knew my parents. My first ever memory of my life was back at St. Joseph's orphanage home back in my supposed hometown. I was apparently picked up from the side of the street by the Reverend and welcomed into the orphanage home. According to what I heard growing up, no news was ever heard from either one of my parents. And although growing up, I had serious hatred and I resented them for quite a lot for abandoning me, not at any age but while I was still an infant, and it was only at the mercy of the Reverend that I'm still alive to this very day, this hatred in me soon quenched. When the people I grew up with in the orphanage home, those I now regarded as family, were getting adopted by various other families and starting a whole new and different chapter in their lives. I knew right then and there that my hatred for them was unnecessary, as soon I would get adopted by my new family, and I was so sure that my life would be well off, somewhat like how I'd always dreamed it would be. Little did I know that my life was going to change sooner rather than later, and not for the better if I might add. Now, when I was about 10 years of age, my new family soon arrived at the orphanage, and although I wasn't their first choice, they eventually came in over and picked me up, as they felt a connection like none other to me. Now, I was really grateful that finally I could call my own. Now, for a little background of my adoptive family before I continue with my story, my adoptive dad Luke and my adoptive mom Anna have been married for the better part of the last 22 years. They were apparently high school lovers and they'd been together ever since the first day they met each other. My adoptive mom had a complication while giving birth to their first daughter, my adoptive sister Joanne, and this resulted in the loss of her entire womb. This devastated their family, and although they were initially planning on having more than one child, they perished such an idea until they were ready to move forward from their loss. Now this brings us to me and my adoption, as they saw it only fit that it was time they moved on and accepted the reality that they were never going to be able to have a child on their own anymore, and the next step for them was adoption. When my adoptive mom came into the orphanage on the first day, she saw every single one of us children that were available at the time and couldn't make a decision. However, when she came back, she sought for me personally, which resulted in my adoption and a whole lot of other proceedings, all of which took little to no time at all, and then my moving into the home of my new adoptive family. Now, everything was honestly fine and good in our home, until it eventually was not, and I'll explain why this was so. Now, my adoptive sister Joanne was meant to be the golden child of the family, but she was falling short on both her parents' expectations, and this was really weighing down on her seriously. On the other hand, unknown to me that she had such a high hurdle to cross, I was easily meeting all the expectations that she failed to, with ease at that too. Basically, the situation was seeming like I was trying to take her place as the golden child of the family, or at least that was what my adoptive mother was making it out to be, and seeing that my adoptive father was already beginning to direct all the love and attention that he was once showering in abundance to my adoptive sister Joanne, this really hit a sore spot for my adoptive mother Anna, and she sought to make my life a living heck from that moment onwards. Now, she didn't make it overly obvious right at the very beginning. She started off by trying to paint a negative image of me to her husband Luke, and this almost never works out in her favor, as she rarely ever did anything right. After which she moved on to an even higher level by trying to be overwhelmed with inhumane tasks around the house, most of which were quite literally unnecessary at the time, to be very honest. And when she found out that this was also yielding no result whatsoever, she schemed with Joanne to make sure that her next course of action was a success. And I must say, she must have really hated my guts a lot, because the third time was a charm, and this time they really went beyond their comfort zone, all just to make sure my foster father Luke saw me in an entirely different light than he was seeing me in at that time. Now what they did was, Joanne, alongside my foster mom, took it upon themselves to get me expelled from school. Now it might sound plain and simple, but I assure you, there was a lot that was done, and also a lot that was out in place in order for it to happen. As back in high school, I was a straight-A student and was basically on my way to getting a scholarship I'd always wanted to the college of my dreams. Now their plan was to basically ruin any chance of myself ever getting the scholarship. And I must say, they did a really good job at that. With the use of certain connections by my foster mother and Joanne actively contributing, they were able to place strategically ample drug samples all over my belongings both in school and back at home. They basically framed me. Now, on the short run, this ruined any chance I ever had of getting that scholarship, as I knew it was the one thing that would have really made Luke proud. And in the long run, it absolutely destroyed any chances at all of myself ever getting into any college at all, as I was expelled from my high school at the time of the incident. My entire world crumbled around me while I could do nothing but watch, and at the end of it all was Joanne and her mother thinking they had the last laugh. Now, all of this was basically as a result of their jealousy, and the one person's attention they were so desperately craving wasn't apparently interested in any of their antics. The only thing that really mattered to Luke at the time was the fact that I'd completely disappointed him on every front. He apparently believed that I would make him proud, and when the whole incident happened, he just lost all faith in me. And this seriously affected my confidence. I felt all alone yet again. Meanwhile, all of this was just simply proper amusement for my adoptive mother and Joanne. Now fast forward a few years. At this time, Joanne was getting ready to head out to college when an unfortunate incident happened back at Luke's place of work. The company he was working with suddenly announced bankruptcy, and this was as a result of their stock market value plummeting way below expected values. To cut the long story short, he was let off by his company and was practically jobless effective immediately. Now this really had serious effects on our family, as he was the only breadwinner in the family and there were still loads of bills to take care of. To top it all off, Joanne was planning on going off to college, which would have brought a whole other mountain load of debt on the family. Now, at this crucial time in our life, although it would have been better to get through this phase as a family, one that I thought we were, I guess I never truly was a member of the family, as when push came to shove, Luke gave in to Anna's rambling about sending me on my way. The only reason this was on the table was because I refused her offer to head out and seek a part-time job to support the family, when I knew fully well at the time that she was obviously behind the incident that happened, leading to my expulsion from high school and basically ruining my entire life. Anyways, cutting the long story short, I was basically sent on my way, as I was no longer welcomed in their home. I left the house in under 24 hours, as apparently no one could bear to look at my face for the next 24 hours. I was left to my own vices, as they saw this as an opportunity to rid themselves of an ungrateful child. I wandered the streets for the longest time, basically for the most part of the last 3 years, with nothing to my name aside from the clothes on my person and a bag of my belongings. I was struggling to get a job, but even that was proving difficult as the most basic of places. I guess this was due to the fact that I never finished high school, as even fast food places were not so keen on giving a job to someone like myself. I don't know how I survived, but I basically did. And although each day was a trial on its own, I hoped that everything would soon get better than it was. Little did I know what was going to happen to me in the coming days. Now, one fateful afternoon, I was going from restaurant to restaurant, trying to scavenge for my daily meal as I usually do, when I got a call from an unknown number. It was apparently the Reverend from the orphanage I grew up in. He was reaching out to see how I was doing after all these years and also to figure out my whereabouts. When I asked what the reason was, he claimed that a couple came to visit with several documents, which proved that they were related to me. I was confused as I didn't know what to think, nor did I know how to feel at the time. He just told me to find my way back to the orphanage as they were going to return that evening. I made my way back to the orphanage as fast as I could, and when I got there, they were apparently waiting for me. I couldn't believe my eyes. The resemblance was uncanny. I just knew they were my parents from the moment I saw them. At that moment, tears rolled down my cheeks as they ran to embrace me. They explained to me that I was apparently abducted at birth, and my abductor was none other than my biological father's side woman. She did so to get back at him, and after confessing to this only recently, they wasted no time in their search for me, and all their searching led them to this orphanage. I couldn't believe what was happening to me at the time, as it was so unexpected. Anyways, a whole lot of catching up took place, and they basically took me back to their place, my home. This is when I found out that my parents were actually well off. In fact, they were so wealthy that it pales in comparison to what I'd originally thought wealthy would be like. It finally felt good to be home, and with people that would treat me like I was truly their family. Now, all of this didn't soothe the anger and the desire for revenge that I had towards my adoptive family. After a few months had gone by, and I was fully settled in my home, I decided to pay them a little visit, and the sight I came across was nothing short of the perfect moment. They had apparently lost our previous home to the bank, and as a result, were basically living on the streets like I was at the time. I found them on my way to their place. Thankfully, I didn't walk as it would have ruined my perfect payback. I took my biological mom's driver out, and when we passed by them, I just dropped the windows a bit and looked at them dead in the eyes. The state that they were in was simply humiliating, and they couldn't bear to look at me. So to top it all off, I just threw them what little I had on me and went on my way. The way I felt in that moment simply triumphs every other feeling. With that, I had paid every single one of them for the years I suffered alone and for trying to ruin my life for good. Hard to have much remorse or any kind of negative feeling towards these people struggling when they revealed themselves to be awful people. Honestly, they're lucky that OP even threw them what they had on them. OP could have just laughed in their faces and kept on going. Would that really have been too harsh considering the way they treated them and kicked them out? I mean, I guess at some level they did adopt OP, I don't know. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.